Let's jump straight into it. How do we regulate AI in pharma?
That's a really good question. That really depends on the industry at which you're looking to regulate the use for, right? And something that I've been quite forward with in speaking about is the need to identify existing guidelines, such as like ICH, for example, and laying them over complex systems to identify where there's overlay, right? And better be able to explain the complex system in languages that are understood by others, right? And starting there then gives you some foundational principles to be able to then apply toward having a more regulated system.
You've had to, I think, probably go through some kind of growth curve because pharma is just so different. And from the presentation that I saw you give at CPHI, the discussions with pharma, I'm sure, are different than like any company that you're working with.
100%. Pharma is a very precise business, right? When you're talking about the needs of pharmaceutical companies, they have a completely different problem set to your run of the mill businesses out there. And a lot of that is predicated around the idea that there's so many different combinations of change, and there's so many different ways that something can potentially go wrong. They're a lot more risk adverse than almost any other industry you could possibly work in. And that also requires having a deeper understanding of exactly why and how to properly translate complex technology into a language which can be understood by them.
Is most of your work with like people in quality, regulatory, IT?
Most of my work is with people in regulatory affairs.
Okay. How have you like seen the culture of pharma regulatory IT teams as it compares to other industries? I'm just curious because
Very
you're
good
like from the
question.
outside. You're from the outside.
Yeah, very exact. And I say that for a purpose because the way that they look at how you measure something, how you measure a result, it matters big time, right? So when you're using AI in an industry like that, or in a field in that industry like regulatory affairs, you can't have the same question yielding you two different answers, for example, right?
Mm.
So when you start getting into the differences in how you have to actually structure a system to be able to provide an exact answer that's the same answer every time and not have any little nuance in between the two, it gets into a really complex world of measuring that input and output. And I actually like it a little bit better than, let's say, other industries because pharmaceuticals are really best suited for dealing with AI, right? AI in its very nature, like a language model in its very nature, it's a combinatorial problem set, and pharmaceuticals live in the world of combinatorial problem sets, especially if you're doing something like biologicals development, right? Like the amount of factors that can change at any given second, the results you get is it's too much to even really factor, right? Like you can have temperature, you can have air quality, all these different things that can just slightly change, and it completely changes the output of the product.
So you were talking about ICH guidelines. How do we use those to help regulate AI?
Okay, so when we think about ICH, one of the core components that I really like latch onto is the idea of process validation, right? And so if you're going to take a combinatorial problem set, which is really
What does that
what
mean?
an
Combinatorial. You know, what the show is called Let's Combinate, and I work on drug device combination products. So this particular term, you got to drill down. What is combinatorial?
when we think about a combinatorial problem set is where you can have infinite inputs and infinite outputs, right? So that you can have an infinite combination of inputs and you can have an infinite combination of outputs as a result of that. I like to use that as a basis for how I address pharmaceuticals in particular, because this is how pharmaceutical companies think, right? Like when you're developing a new drug, or you're even if you're manufacturing the drug, the variants or and all the different things that can change in the environment of the laboratory that the drug comes from can impact the quality of that drug in particular, right? So that right there is an example of a combinatorial problem where just there's all these combinations that are going to affect the output of something. So when we think about that in AI,
But so hold on a
the
second.
different
So I understand what you're saying with the example there with pharma, but with manufacturing a product, I think the part that I would maybe challenge and try to get your feedback on is it actually isn't infinite inputs. There is a limited, there might be a lot of inputs, which is why we have to do risk assessments that are sometimes hundreds or thousands of line items, but it's never to infinity. And so
for sure.
there is a natural limit, and you have to like risk assess what are the most important ones and then what is actually foreseeable, negligible, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas with AI, I think the difference is it is actually infinite.
Yes, but like in the case of being a provider, right? So when we think about AI, the closest thing that we actually have in industry right now to being able to regulate it is what we do in pharmaceuticals. It is pharmaceuticals. So when you think about how do you develop out like your checklist of all these different coverages that you have to check for, really what you're doing is you're performing coverage on the output, right? So you're doing an assessment to develop coverage, and it's no different than what you do when you're validating a combinatorial set. Like when we do red teaming really is just developing coverage across a combinatorial set.
What all could go? Okay, so continue spoon feed me this. I think it's a little bit of an abstract thing for somebody who's worked in pharma, medical device to try and understand how you vet something like an AI. So how do you page it? Like, do you write a procedure and say these are the only things that you're allowed to do?
So what you do is just like how you mentioned, you develop your coverage tests, right? You have the same kind of coverage, which is essentially your red team that tells you how the model performs under certain circumstances, right? So certain inputs are going to be tested, and then you're going to have your output that you are essentially testing for. Now, when we're thinking about this problem for pharma, what we generally want to do is we want to actually treat it as a process validation step, right? So the input you're testing, then you're validating the output as well. So you that's by having anything that touches AI be considered or be required to go through a process validation step after. Now what you're doing is you're essentially validating that the outputs are within a specified range that's acceptable. And from there, you now know, okay, now we have a little bit more confidence that this is within a range that we can consider good. And you can decide whether or not to release that to an end user.
So
And
talk
that,
on you go. Finish your thought.
so essentially, what we have to do is we have to take the data itself, right, that we want to leverage through this process. You take the data, you have your data searchable, so you're able to search for it. You have to have that data represented in the correct way to be able to properly search it and know that you're getting the correct data when you do retrieve it. So you have that, and then what you want to have is you want to have a knowledge graph on top of that, which then further allows for you to drill down to the particular data in certain domains that are relevant to an input or relevant to an output. And now what you're able to do is on both the input and the output of an AI or an LLM in particular, you're able to then validate by running through this process of essentially going through a hierarchy of topics to drill down to what in particular is being queried and validate that the same domains match on the input and on the output, right? Because then that tells you how far the output is really deviating from the request of the user.
So walk me use cases because like you saying that you primarily work with regulatory teams is that would almost be the last team that I would think that you'd be working with. Like I would think maybe you're working with drug discovery teams or maybe you're working with IT teams or maybe you're working with quality teams helping them with what that's a lot of work. What
Yeah.
are the use cases in regulatory?
So it turns out that all the a lot of the functions of these different teams are things that kind of boil up to regulatory, because when regulatory has to take a dossier, for example, and they have to take the hard work of all the other teams that's been distilled into a dossier, and then they have to present that dossier to the FDA to get approval on a new drug, that information has to be as accurate as possible. And you have to make sure that there's nothing hallucinated from a system in there. So you really have to be mindful when you're at the regulatory level for that reason, right? Now obviously there's impacts which could be greater earlier on in the stream of that data acquisition, like you said, in the actual particular departments. But from the standpoint of where this impacts the company the most is really when it gets to the point of the actual dossier and the information contained being interrogated by a regulatory body like a FDA or what have you.
Yeah. So are you that like prior to submission, they're saying, let's say, submission tens of thousands of pages sometimes, usually thousands of pages. When you talk like the submission itself, maybe a few hundred pages, but the reference documents make it like an unbelievable amount of paper. Are you saying like you put the whole submission in an AI and you say look for contradictions?
So you do that, right? That's one example. But really, pharmaceutical companies are starting to think about how they can take all of the information that makes up those thousands of pages that go into a dossier, and particularly the reference material for that dossier, and how they can distill that down as fast as possible into a qualified dossier that they can submit. And likewise, they want to accelerate the amount of time that it takes to actually properly interrogate that dossier.
So like the way pharma applications happen are done using the ECTD, right?
Yep,
Which is yeah. So it sounds like you know what I'm talking about.
very familiar. Yep,
Which has a format, and there are some really unique. We talked about nuance before we talking, right there before we started recording. I should say there are certain unique topics where you're like, oh, I wonder should I put it in this section? Should I put it in that section? But by and large, those are far in between. There have been enough submissions where it's like standardized to the point where the ECTD stands for Common Technical Document. Like it's common. Everybody knows where to put this versus that. And so, what is the problem that like having a chatbot be able to find something that like I'm saying like drug A versus drug B. If I'm some if I'm entry level reviewer 1, I know that container closure information is in section 3.2 point whatever it is. I think it's 3.2 point P point 2.4 or something. I think
yep.
that's it. But I don't even need to know the number because there's a whole table of contents of where it should be. So where's the
So when you're, I'm happy you mentioned ECTD, because ECTD, when you really think about it, is a hierarchy, right? And this is another reason why it's really important.
it's a pyramid the way that they show it. Yeah.
Yeah, if you look at it from like the top down, like the different, you have different levels to it, right? So you have
Yeah.
you have sections, subsections, right? Essentially what happens is like when you're forming your dossier, you have all these different areas of, you have like your clinical trials, you have all the stuff that has to come in to support what claims you're making, right? And
Mm.
what you want to do is you don't want to limit the, I venture to say, efficacy, but you don't want to limit the efficacy of the claims you're making to a very narrow scope. What you want to do is you want to be able to take in the full scope of the data you have to bring about the best overall document that actually explains, all right, this is what we tested, this is what we have, all of the details in as accurate as possible results. So you can't have where there's even a slight chance in a system like this of there being a hallucinated fact somewhere, right? Because what will happen is somebody will read it.
But I'm comparing. Let's compare against submissions that weren't generated with AI. So everything was manually written. Let's say. Okay, so there wouldn't be the case for there wouldn't be a situation where there was a hallucinated fact. So that's where I'm trying to understand like where does the AI come in? Is it in the authoring of the like the first pass authoring of a submission?
I think it's on two sides. So it's on the authoring side, right? So an AI comes in on how you actually source the information to produce that your document. Then on the other side, when it's time to actually interrogate that document, you don't want an AI hallucinating answers if you're interrogating the document with an agent, right? So if you have a chatbot that has a dossier with tens of thousands of pages in it within its access scope, you don't want that chatbot making up information and then presenting that to a regulator. And also, you want to make sure that whenever a regulator asks a certain question, they're able to get the exact same answer back, right? Because nothing is going to scare a regulator more than putting in the same question to an agent and getting back many different answers.
I haven't really done on this topic. This is maybe the first interview that I've talked about AI a little bit, but the regulatory piece is the part that I just don't understand. And I've heard some regulatory agencies talk, health authorities talk about how they plan on using AI to make reviews more efficient. Have you been in any of those conversations? Like I know you do some
Absolutely.
work with governments.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
so how, like where's the proprietary it's my data? Like where does that come in? Can a regulator just run a submission through ChatGPT?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
assuming they
So,
can't, right?
well, they're trying to get to that point, right? So again, when you have this issue of the combinatorial problem set, anytime that AI is used in that data acquisition feed, you now have a problem. You have a problem of combinatorial sets, right? On the regulator side, if you're interrogating the a dossier, for example, what you're essentially doing is you're taking this document that's been submitted to you, and normally what would happen as is there would be questions that arise while they're reviewing the dossier, and then they would manually go back and forth and say, "Hey, what's the deal with this? How come you're going really heavy on this section, but the thing that's actually relevant to it, you guys only have a couple of paragraphs about, or what have you?" So those
The
things
back and
there
forth, the
for
information.
months, right? Sometimes for a really long time. But if you
Yeah.
can reduce the amount of time it takes to have that back and forth so that it can just be asked through an agent, you're now going to accelerate the throughput of new drugs to the market, because now you don't have those months of back and forth. You have where a regulator can drill down to the point they're comfortable with, and then they can manually reach out and say, "Hey, we have some really specific questions about this and this. What are your answers?"
Okay. So let's imagine an alternate universe where Subi would ever work in regulatory. I don't think I ever would. Let's say I'm submitting a dossier, right? And I know what I submitted it on day X, and I know my PDUFA action date is date Y, and I'm just like sitting on my thumbs waiting, right? Are they going to request anything? Am I going to get approval? It sounds like you're saying that there would be like Subi.io that I say, here's the submission, plus this, I don't know, USB drive or what is going to talk and act like the regulatory person that submitted the file. And they're just going to be able to talk to this. I'm making a like a dumbed down version of this, but they would talk to SubiBot and he would answer all their questions so I don't have to. That seems crazy. That seems risky.
Yeah,
that seems like I would rather just take the time to, I would rather wait a couple months to be able to manicure the responses because these things currently go through lots of discussion, massaging, regulatory publishing, and the responses are typically not like a chatbot response. You know what I'm
This is
saying?
exactly what the FDA is actually currently investigating. So they're actually actively investigating whether or not this is a pathway to accelerate the approval of new drugs.
But that I'm trying to like understand where the pharma company would be in this. Would they develop chatbots that they submit with their, or is it the regulator that has their own, or both?
I think honestly, pharma has to think of this first, right? So they have to actually have the ability to essentially act as the regulator in interrogating their own document.
So you're saying they need to prove the concept. We trained something that could get you quicker results.
Yeah, just they need to essentially prove the architecture and prove the concept, and then they need to provide the guidance to the regulators that say, okay, this is how we do this and this is why we know it works. Now you guys can try it yourself, run your tests, and if you determine that this is an acceptable thing, then you move forward in that way.
How much time, because you're involved in this space, like how much time can it save? Are we talking about like instant approvals, instant rejections?
So just on the standpoint of forming the dossier, we I've heard as many as a million working hours over the course of a company that might have more than 30,000 employees.
Okay, I'm trying to, I don't even know how to define that in a way that like makes sense for me. A million working hours is 1,000 people spending 1,000 hours. What, a year is 2,000 hours? So call it 500 people spending a full year. So 500 full years to support a dossier, 500 people for a year. And you're talking about like the research it takes to develop it, writing the individual reports,
Yeah,
waiting for equipment and
primarily in the actual data acquisition, right? So it's
oh,
one
okay.
thing
So
to get the
you're not talking about taking the data and just writing the submission. You're talking about actually generating the data to be able to eventually
well,
submit it.
the first one, right? The
Yeah.
amount of time it takes to go out and find the data you need in an
Mm,
organization that's large, where you have just hundreds of millions of documents, right?
right.
That's number one. Number two is the amount of time it
Is that a
takes.
real number? 100 millions? I believe it, but
Yeah, even your mid market pharmaceutical companies have over 850 million documents
get out
in
of
their
here.
enterprise. Yeah, easily. When you have
Wow.
kind of enterprise data that you have to distill through to find the information that is most relevant for you, that takes time. And then actually taking that data that you now have and then distilling that down into a context that's relevant for what it is that you're looking to explain takes time, right? So if you can reduce both of those in one shot by being able to faster acquire the data in your data supply pipeline and then faster manipulate that data into the context that you're looking to use it, that will save you time. So both of those
Mm.
stages are crucial.
So how much time are we talking? So
Million,
is that 500, is that like the 500 people going for a year? It top, like that seems like pretty high. So that would be like your, that would be top on the range?
no, this is without even having, this is like a couple
Normal.
departments. Like this is
Yeah.
not like a whole global rollout even. And I
Mm.
would consider that actually like conservative because that's not using AI for everything. It's only using AI for very specific roles within that workflow.
When people talk about like the AI stuff philosophic, I've heard thing of you need to take things to their logical end, right? Do you think that with this kind of technology, we would be able to eventually get to like instant approvals or
I don't
like,
think that
I'm just trying to,
yeah,
I'm
I
not
don't think
understand
that's
where.
in the range. Like I think that that probably shouldn't even really be a thing. Really, what we should aim for is how we reduce the amount of friction
Back and
between
forth.
having the proposed dossier and having the approval, right? Or getting the approval, or even a rejection, right? The faster that we can drive a potential new drug that has potential positive benefits to either an approval or rejection is going to save pharmaceutical companies a lot of money, which will allow for them to spend a lot more resources on better quality, all these other things that are very important.
Have you explored applications in quality?
When we're thinking about the application of AI in quality, one of my favorite examples to look at is biologicals, right? So when you're essentially, and for people who might not fully understand what this process looks like, when you're developing a new biological, you're essentially growing a protein in a substance, right? And the ability to be able to actually measure what's happening throughout that process generates an insane amount of data. I've been to a couple biologicals labs in Europe, and the even the sensors that they use to be able to determine what the state of that biological is in at that time is insane. It generates terabytes of data per second, right? So being able to properly filter out what's within range and what's out of range when you have these like swimming results, because nothing is ever stable and static when you're dealing with this kind of work, and you know that more than anyone in quality. So being able to take the context of what it is you're doing and being able to find the appropriate ranges is a really important thing. Also, being able to find what the correct context is to do that is important. So, I've been thinking a lot about how we represent data correctly at scale to be able to keep up with the amount of information that's acquired in this process, and then also how you create systems around that that allow for you to properly oversee it and know that you're within these acceptable ranges as you're stepping throughout that development process.
Have you had any discussion with companies about how to integrate some of the AI tools that you work with into GMP?
Not as much. I actually think that's a little bit surprising. A lot of what people are thinking about right now is very much at the surface level of where this everything is going, right? And for example, even when I have the few conversations I have a year with IT teams at pharmaceutical companies, there's a varying culture there across company to company, where sometimes you have newer IT staff inside of a company and they happen to think that the range for error is higher than it is higher. In some cases, they think that the acceptance for error should be zero, right? And it gets very tricky when you're dealing with the different cultures, like within a company, because especially when it's I find when it's newer talent that isn't necessarily used to the rigid requirements of pharma, because you have to really help mold them from this risk acceptable
Reel
lifestyle.
them in. You got to reel them
Yeah,
in. Yeah.
because especially today, like everybody is willing to take on the risk of implementing AI, especially
They're
in Europe,
excited.
because there's less risk now that you actually have legislation on how to legally implement AI in Europe, right? So they're a lot more willing to implement it, but just because you implement it doesn't mean you're implementing it in a way that's actually compatible with the pharmaceutical industry.
Uh, Last question. Do you think the pharma industry will be completely different in 10, 20 years?
Absolutely, hands down. There's You can't say otherwise, because sheer complexity that a human has to go through to be able to manage it's almost like having a car engine in your brain, right? Where you're composing all these little pieces of a dossier that's huge, right? And this is why it takes teams big teams to fill out a dossier, to get a dossier formed. But the amount of like pieces that each person on that team has to be managing in their head to say, okay, I'm going to put this piece over here, I'm going to put this piece over here, this piece here, just to build this one package is huge. And if the more we can do to reduce that cognitive pressure, and the more we can do to actually push a lot of that off, and then just have people validating the outputs and have real numerical systems that validate the output, and then allow pharmaceuticals to focus on what they do best, which is producing the actual drug and doing the trials, that I think a lot more emphasis is going to go there in the future.
Where can people find you, Dominic? Where can they learn about DrainPipe?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Dominick Romano. You can find me on X, D Romano CPM is my handle. I'm usually streaming all the time on X. Yeah, I host this thing called AI Jam, where we run these X spaces for 24, 48 hours straight, and kids from around the world will come in, and big professionals jump in, right? AI regulators from Europe, from all over jump in, and we all just have really complicated conversations, or we talk about some of the news. I try to foster the conversation to everyday people as well, because it's one thing to be behind the scenes and have these closed door conversations with policymakers and regulators and people in pharma or people in other industries, but it's a completely different thing when those like the everyday people don't know what is actually being discussed. And in order for me to have those conversations behind closed doors with the needs and concerns of everyday people represented, I have to be actively engaged with everyday people to properly represent those concerns.
Thanks for coming on, Dominic.
Thanks for having me on.